Working from our definition as comics that are pictures telling a story, we've looked at all kinds of things we wouldn't think of as comics, such as tapestries or graffiti, but they definitely tell stories through the pictorial images. Finally, we traced comic strips, which most people would call comics and newspapers, and today we'll get into comic books, which this is the founder of the modern American comic book. This is Maxwell Gaines. He had a varied career. He had been a veteran in World War I, which they said that he was wounded with shrapnel in his leg that would always act up and make him very cranky. So he did go through several different jobs, including a teacher, a principal, and a salesman in the Great Depression, which while he was working as a salesman, he was cleaning out the store there in New York City and had a bunch of old newspapers in a big box. So he was taking them out to the dumpster. And a fellow stopped him and said, "Hey, do you mind if I dig the comics out there? I want to give them to my kids." And he said, "No, I'm a busy guy. I've got stuff to do. Get out of here. If you want to dig through them, you can dig them out of the dumpster." And the guy said, "Well, I'll give you a dime." And Maxwell Gaines had an idea that people were willing to actually pay for comics. So after a couple of different directions with it, he finally got together with a publisher and put together Famous Funnies in 1933. This was an anthology magazine that was a whole series of comics. Instead of buying the newspaper for comics, you just buy the comics straightforward. So a few famous characters, such as Mutt and Jeff there in the lower left corner, as well as a lot of new characters that people might not recognize. And they produced a couple of thousand copies, put them on newsstands in New York City, and they sold like wildfire. It was uncanny how much people enjoyed these. So they started up a full publishing company and got going with Famous Funnies #1 and decided that every month they would come out with a whole new set of comics, 100 pages, all for 10 cents, which is about $5 or $6 in today's money. So not bad. And a wide variety, lots of kids' comics and funny things like Mutt and Jeff, but then also action like Tailspin Tommy, highlights of history, a maze a minute, screen oddities, all kinds of fun stuff. So other companies, of course, started jumping on this as quickly as possible, and a lot of those adventure strips that we saw in the 1930s, like Dick Tracy and the Phantom, were adapted into these comic books. And then, 1938, we had this guy, Superman. So his story is that in the 1930s, there were a couple of teenagers working in Ohio, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and they liked making comics. So they were creating all these characters for Detective Comics, which was the big publisher at the time. Later, it would evolve into DC, so where all of DC came from. And what they really wanted was newspaper comic strips, since those were the real cartoonists. Everybody was excited. But they just couldn't quite get anything sold. Despite trying a couple of different directions, like sci-fi stories with the original Superman, who was a kind of this despotic character who controlled everyone through telepathy, and some detectives and some secret agent type stories. Finally, they put together this new idea of a hero who has these superpowers, which is why we call them superpowers, because it's Superman, and why we have superheroes to this day. If they had called him Mighty Man, then we'd be talking about mighty heroes. But they had this idea for a comic, and they shopped it around originally as a comic strip. That didn't work out. But one of the assistant editors picked it up for these new comic books and decided, hey, we're starting up this new line called Action Comics. It's not detective stories necessarily, but full of action. They certainly agreed because they were 19, and in fact even sold the rights to Superman to guarantee that it would be marketed on a big time. Which a lot of people say, well, that was a bad move, but if you're a couple of 19-year-olds from Ohio, it actually worked out pretty well in their favor. In fact, it was a guaranteed market for every Superman comic they could produce. And they produced a lot. Starting, of course, with Action Comics #1. And here we have something that people had never really seen before. You go and see detectives and so forth, but you'd never see a guy in a wrestling suit with a cape picking up a car and smashing against a rock with people running around screaming. It just blew people's minds. And so we get the first ever Superman story, where we get an explanation of his powers, how he can lift things by being this alien from a world millions of years advanced from Earth. He can leap 1/8 of a mile, he can raise tremendous weights, and run faster than an express train. Hasn't gotten a lot of his powers yet, no actual flight and things like that. He's just very strong, essentially. And even a little scientific explanation comparing him to ants and grasshoppers. In the story, he races across the landscape here to rescue a woman who has been wrongfully accused with tying up another lady and bursting into the governor's mansion. So not quite the gentle Superman of today, but quite a character. But he wasn't the only hero through the issue. We had a whole bunch of others, like this Western from Chuck Dawson. Zatara, the Master Magician, arguably also a superhero, using his magic to be able to fight the bad guys. But others would say that he's more of a pulp hero. We get some nonfiction from Marco Polo, which as close to nonfiction as Marco Polo's writings were, which were hardly. Scoop Scanlan, 5-star reporter. So a reporter without superpowers, so something you'd very much see in like a Detective Comics, but works very well here in Action Comics as well. Pep Morgan, a boxer who won't go down and fights his way through the mysteries. Tex Thompson, personal favorite, who's a Texas oilman who now travels the world and solves mysteries. And everybody loves these superheroes great. Nobody likes Superman. They all want these stories. And DC is very eager to get more superheroes going. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster just can't produce enough. So they go to this guy, Bob Kane, and say, hey, we want another one of these Supermen. And Bob Kane said that that's a stupid idea. He really didn't care for superheroes. They weren't believable. But this is his job and, likes money. So he designed this guy who doesn't necessarily have powers, but has a lot of gadgets. He's really into Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines and gadgets and things like that. As well as, having genius level capabilities at chemistry and detective work and all this, and develops Batman, which here we have his original incarnation. Which one of the writers at DC, Bill Finger, gave some notes on this and said, I like the black, but we've already got red on the Superman guys, so maybe more than just a little domino mask. Like, let's give him a whole cowl and really make him dark. And so we get the first ever appearance of Batman in 1939. Very dark, grays and blacks. And it was pretty dark back then. Today, Batman is known for, being pretty gentle, quote-unquote. Never uses a gun. Back then, he totally did. In fact, they had the Bat Tommy gun that he would go around and shoot bad guys with. The Joker, right, falling into that vat of acid. Originally, Batman pushed him. It was just kind of a thing he did. There's a famous comic where he swoops down with the bat plane and picks a guy up off the street with a noose, clearly killing him. It's dark stuff. Which, too dark, DC decided that they needed to sell more comics to the kids, since everybody knows that only kids read comics, right? That's not true. But they did want to target it more toward kids, so they softened him up and they gave him a sidekick. The first ever sidekick, Robin, the Boy Wonder, this former acrobat who turns to solving crimes and helping out the Batman. Well, with people loving this so much, they get a lot of other companies jumping on the superhero bandwagon as much as possible. Captain America comes up in 1940 from Whiz Comics and has a lot of power similar to Superman. In fact, here he is not just picking up a car, but throwing it. And it, in fact, turned into a Supreme Court case of whether he is copying this Superman. And a lot of people said that no, he's got original powers. He gets them from the wizard Shazam. It's all magic based. Yes, he is super, but not Superman. Whereas some of the artists testified that they were handed Superman comics by their editors who said, do this, which was a little suspicious. Ultimately, Captain Marvel would run out in the 1940s and be picked up by DC, which is why, strangely enough, DC and not Marvel own Captain Marvel. All-American Comics gets started up by Maxwell Gaines. He'd gotten started with the funnies, which he liked his comedy, and he genuinely believed that comics were for kids, but it's a big market, and he definitely wants to jump on board with that. And so he gets his guys to create superheroes like the Green Lantern, which very different from today's Green Lantern. This one had a magic lantern that would transform into a ring and gave him pretty much whatever powers he needed for that issue. He could travel through time. He had telepathy. He could not just give power blasts or create matter, but actually warp the universe itself with it. So a bit overpowered, but very good for this golden age of comics. Flash got started up with just all kinds of heroes coming out of the woodwork. Hawkman, you might know to him. Lesser known, of course, Johnny Thunder, who had a living lightning bolt that would obey his will. The Whip, who was this bounty hunter come back from the dead. And Cliff Cornwall, Ace Pilot, which I don't know that he's around too much these days. Shortly thereafter, in 1940, we get our first ever female superhero, Wonder Woman. Her story from Sensation comes out of a kind of partnership between DC and these All-American Comics. She was created by Will Eisner, which Dr. Eisner was kicked out of Harvard for being too weird, which should tell you something about him. So he was a big promoter. He was a psychologist. He worked on a lot of the processes that would eventually lead to things like the lie detector test. He was kind of the psychology behind it, pairing with the biology of how to measure those symptoms of lying. And a lot of people tie that to the lasso of truth, which other people aren't so sure. But we do get our original Wonder Woman from the Isle of the Amazons, who comes to man's world to show how we can be better. So Will Marston did some thinking on it and went to his wife and said, I want to create a superhero, but I'm tired of all these guys, just beating people up and throwing them in jail. Like, that's not solving the issue. I want to create a superhero that will actually do therapy and talk to people and see what's at the root of their problems. And she said, that's good, but you should create her as a woman because no one's going to believe that men will do that. And so we got Wonder Woman. And then World War II happened. So we had all of these superheroes, people who had these astounding powers and could defeat all the bad guys, but we didn't have anyone for them to really fight. We had a couple of villains show up, like the Joker or Lex Luthor, but they would always get beaten up and locked up in the jail at the end. With World War II, they had a real villain. They had somebody that couldn't be defeated. You can't just walk in there and say, the war's over. Which they did try that initially with Superman. Here in 1939, after the invasion of Poland, Superman swam across the Atlantic and went to Hitler and said, I'd like to land a strictly non-Aryan sock on your jaw, but there's no time for that. We're going with me while I visit a certain pal of yours. So he grabbed Hitler, picked up Mussolini, took him to the World Court, and the war was over. However, that wasn't clearly what happened in reality, but it did give us a good background of superheroes going after these bad guys. So another company, Timely Comics, jumped on board with this and gave us Captain America, this superhero who was fighting on the front lines. Here he is punching Hitler in the face, which there's a famous line from the Captain America movie a few years ago where he talks about hitting Hitler 100 times, which he did. That adds up all the different covers where he got a chance to punch Hitler in the face. And he too had a sidekick just to make sure the kids could get on it. Bucky, who is a boy photographer with the military, and hardly the battle-trodden Bucky of today, but something that the kids could identify with, and so they can spend their dimes on it too. He's also very good at getting kidnapped from time to time and giving Captain America somebody to go rescue. Here we have the first page of Captain America explaining how he got his powers through the super soldier serum, which it's kind of cool if you look at the Captain America movie, where they do some shot-for-shot things on this. They show the laboratory where he's being created and some of these shadowy figures in the observation room up top, which, of course, lead to the killing of Captain America's creator, and that's why we don't have a lot of Captain Americas. as it says here, that he is looking to be the first of a corps of super agents whose mental and physical ability will make them a terror to saboteurs and spies. Because America hadn't entered the war yet. We don't enter the war until December 1941. So Captain America coming out in summer of 1941 was really ahead of its time. In fact, a lot of people came out in front of what became Marvel Comics offices there in New York City and protested, saying, "Hey, you're going to drag us into this war. You can't publish comics like that." But of course, by that point, we very much needed those comics because Hitler did need to be stopped. So Marvel Comics brought in its other heroes. They had already done the Submariner for years, this Prince of Atlantis who was a terror to humans, originally kind of an anti-hero, but by this time he's got Nazis to fight, so he's clearly a superhero. And we have the Human Torch, the original one, who was actually an android powered by super fire that enabled him to really blow up all the bad guys. Here they are teaming up, fighting these really dehumanized, kind of ogreish Nazis at this point. Just absolute explosion of power that you could see through World War II. Here's another one with Captain America driving a motorcycle across people's faces. They're just really in a position where you can do anything in comics and it's considered good. It's part of the war propaganda. With such popularity, other companies start jumping on board, and we get lots of superheroes such as the Black Terror. And here's Black Terror with his sidekick who gets a machine gun, punching a V-2 rocket, saving the Supreme Allied headquarters. Captain Marvel comes back with a kid. Superboy had done well enough that Captain Marvel jumps on board with Captain Marvel Jr. The original Daredevil comes out and fights Hitler, which not the Daredevil we know today, but a circus acrobat who just joined the war effort. And he gets to punch Hitler too, and looks like Himmler as well. And then things start getting weird. With so many people jumping on board, just as with any trend, you start getting stranger and stranger things, such as Eagle and a sidekick Buddy. Or the Fighting Yank. He has a magic hat, this tricorn hat that was given to him by his great-grandfather who fought in the American Revolution, which enables him to go out and defeat the Japanese emperor and let people arrive in Tokyo. A personal favorite recreated a few years ago, which, as part of copyright, to maintain your control of characters, you got to reuse them from time to time, and so the Destroyer was brought back, shown as a guy with still superpowers, but by that point, he's getting into his 80s and was suffering Alzheimer's. And it kind of did a really interesting exploration on what it means to have this much power and what happens when you can't control it anymore. Uncle Sam himself became a superhero from National Comics, and he had a just outright baby with a machine gun there. And even some kids, the Cub Commandos, this kind of Boy Scout troop who got on the wrong barge and ended up getting shipped to the front lines to fight the bad guys themselves. And by the time that the war was starting to wind down, we were getting just folks who weren't trying, like Captain Terror from USA Comics, and here we have Hitler driving into the New York subway system himself with a kind of drill car and soldiers marching into New York City, which probably not going to happen. But you have a superhero with a yellow ascot, so you got to do something about it. People by this time had started to get a little bit of superhero fatigue. A lot of these guys folded as soon as World War II was over, because after you defeat Hitler, what do you do? And instead, we get a few survivors like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Captain America gets frozen in an iceberg. But for the most part, superheroes are done. As we'll see in the next class, we'll have other genres take the place as what's really going on in American comics.